Okay, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Alexander Kay. I'm the director of the Schusterman Center for Israel Studies here at Brandeis University. It is a tremendous pleasure and an honor to be hosting today this event for the publication of a new book by our tremendously valued colleague, Professor Ilana Szobel. The book is The Unchosen Body: Disability Culture in Israel. I'm going to introduce our speakers. Let me just, before that, give a couple of notes especially to our audience online. The first thing is we're very glad to be joined by Vernice and Cassie. Cassie first, then Vernice, who will be our ASL interpreters today. If you'd like to see ASL interpretation, you should have an interpretation button, maybe a globe icon on your Zoom screens that you can turn on or off and resize as you like. We also have live captioning available, and you can use the CC button on your screen to turn that on or off. The way that today is going to happen is that after Professor Szobel gives a presentation, she'll be joined in conversation by Professor Julia Watts Belser, who I'll introduce in a moment. And after that, we'll have a Q&A from here, audience in the room and online. If you'd like to submit a question online, use the Q&A feature in the Zoom, in your Zoom screen. The final sort of housekeeping note is that the book has very recently been published, and just in case you, by chance, have not yet had a chance to buy your copy, you are eligible for a 20% discount on the purchase of the book at WSU Press, Wayne State University Press, by using the discount code RSAVER, R-S-A-V-E-R, and all of that information will be emailed to the online audience after the event. So let me now briefly introduce our two speakers today, and I say briefly because they are both extremely decorated and prolific scholars. But in the interest of time, let me give a rather abridged introduction to each of them. Professor Ilana Szobel is our colleague here, core faculty, the Schusterman Center for Israel Studies, and is also the interim director for the Mandel Center for the Humanities at Brandeis. She has a number of very important books, including a Poetics of Trauma, which is the definitive study of Dahlia Ravikovitch, Flesh of My Flesh: Sexual Violence in Modern Hebrew Literature, which is a literary history of sexual assault in Hebrew literature, and of course, The Unchosen Body that we are celebrating today. She has published many articles on a number of many different topics, and has also published her own book of poetry, which will be immediately evident. If anybody, as soon as you read the book, you will see that it is the work not only of a scholar, but also of a poet. It's beautifully written. After Ilana gives her introductory remarks, she'll be joined in conversation by Julia Watts Belser, who we're very happy to welcome today. Professor Watts Belser is a rabbi, scholar, and spiritual teacher who's a professor of Jewish studies and core faculty of the Disability Studies program at Georgetown University, and is also a senior research fellow at the Berkeley Center for Religion, Peace, and World Affairs. She's a longtime advocate for disability and gender justice, and is the director of the Disability and Climate Change Public Archive project, which documents the insights of disabled activists and artists and others who are navigating climate crisis, and has published a National Jewish Book Award winning volume just a couple of years ago called Loving Our Own Bones: Disability Wisdom and the Spiritual Subversiveness of Knowing Ourselves Whole. So with that, I'm very happy to pass over to Ilana to introduce her work.
Thank you, Alex, for this very kind introduction, and hello, everybody here in the room and on Zoom. I want to begin by expressing my sincere gratitude to the Schusterman Center for Israel Studies for hosting this book launch, and especially to its director, Professor Alexander Kay, and Senior Associate Director, Dr. Shana Wise, for initiating this event, yet another example of their ongoing support and generosity. Many thanks also to the amazing staff who work with such care and commitment to make today's events possible. My Dewis, Karen Godbold, Freddie Chi, and Wendy Schwartz. And last but not least, I don't have enough words to thank Professor Julia Watts Belser, not only for sharing her wisdom with us today, but for being an incredible supporter of this project from its very beginning. You didn't just teach me about disability justice, you also showed me how kindness and gentleness can make both writing and life much richer. So thank you, Julia. And with that, let me turn to the book. So I don't know if you can see the slide, because I don't see what people see. Okay. Thank you. When my child was little, there was nothing they loved more than pretending to be pregnant. Sometimes I played the friend who had also just given birth, and sometimes I was the mother joyfully discovering that her child was pregnant. No matter which role I played, my child was always the one who was pregnant, and they always gave birth to a beautiful baby. One day, they asked me, at what age can I really get pregnant and become a parent? And I, who try not to give answers that aren't true, told them that I need to think about it. So I thought and thought until eventually I wrote the book we're celebrating today. Their questions surprised me. To them, there was never any doubt that they would become a parent. But for me, the question carried something deeper, connected to the fact that they are on the autistic spectrum. It made me wonder whether an autistic child, once grown, might be able to become a parent. True to the proud tradition of academic mothers, I immediately turned to all the reliable sources I could find and read every scholarly study on sexuality and parenting for people on the spectrum. It was hard, it was depressing, it was painfully boring, and above all, it was completely unconvincing. Nothing in those grim descriptions of my child's supposed future, written by respected doctors and therapists, matched the joyful, creative, full of life child I knew. The same child who every evening now blessed me with not one, but two new grandchildren on a regular basis. And then I did what very tired academic mothers do. I stopped reading books and started scrolling endlessly through social media. And that's where I found the extraordinary community the book is about. Artists with a wide range of disabilities, physical, neurological, psychiatric, intellectual. They ask difficult questions about their lives and the world around them. And they answered from lived experiences, from their loves and dreams, their frustrations and failures, their successes. In other words, from their disability wisdom. I began meeting many of them. I watched the remarkable films they directed and the stunning photographs they created. I attended their dance performances. I read their poetry books, the poetry books they published, and the poems still waiting to see the light of day. I wandered through galleries and searched library archives and databases. And that is how my book came into being. Out of these encounters and conversation grew the questions that shape the book. I apply a disability justice lens, one that highlights intersectionality and how different systems of oppression apply each other, to explore how Israeli poets, filmmakers, and performance artists with disabilities approach accessibility in their work. I address accessibility to artistic, cultural, and political spaces in Israel. I examine, for example, how artists with disabilities offer new readings of traditional Jewish texts through their stuttering, how others choose to expose their bodies in order to express sexuality and pleasure, and how their dance and films challenge familiar narratives of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, opening new horizons of growth. The book focuses not on how artists with disabilities are represented or unrepresented in Israeli culture, but on their self-representation. Most of the works I discuss were created by disabled artists themselves. And because the book approaches disability not as something to be overcome, but rather as a starting point for social change, it explores disability culture in Israel as a space where dancers, poets, and filmmakers challenge dominant norms and create distinctive cultural language. So who are these, all of these women that I feature in the book, and what do they do actually? So since the focus is on disability culture, I began by looking at how artists experience their disabilities and how this shapes their work. What really interested me was exploring cultural accessibility, access to artistic spaces and to an artistic language that doesn't deny or hide disability. Take vocal artist Victoria Hanna. The slide that is presented shows two images, one of her in front of a chalkboard with Hebrew letters, and another against a white background with letters appearing alongside her voice. Victoria Hanna, who has stuttered since childhood, uses her experience to show stuttering not as a limitation, but as a source of creativity. Rona Sofer directs autobiographical documentary films, developing a new cinematic language, one that rejects the ableist gaze and makes her experience of disability the very center of her artistic and cinematic exploration. The slide shows two images of Rona Sofer. In one, she gazes at her reflection in a hospital mirror, cane in hand. In other, she leans on her cane near a dance studio window. And the poet Shiri Oved insists on imagining a future for herself. Through her poetry, she resists the ableist idea of a future of no future for people with disabilities, insisting instead on access to the ability to imagine a future for herself and for others with disabilities as well. Because the idea of an accessible future is always connected to the past, it was really important for me to think about access to the poetic history of disability. I wanted to ask how and where does disability itself leave traces in Israeli poetry? And how do poets discover those traces and through them create a genealogy that others can engage with and respond to? To understand why this matters, it helps to remember that within the tradition of Hebrew poetry, there isn't really a recognized literary lineage of poets with physical disabilities. So it's especially interesting to see where contemporary poets, who are already somewhat aware of disability culture, turn to when they need a model for writing. Looking closely at the work of poet Orit Marton, I think I missed, and Inbal Eshel Kahansky, who writes from their sick beds, I show how, through poetic dialogues with earlier sick or disabled poets, contemporary disabled poets create a kind of archive, a fragmented, partial lineage of Israeli poetry written by sick and disabled women. I suggest to think about this poetic genealogy as a care web, a network of accessibility created by and for people with disabilities. And while we usually think of creativity, or while we usually think of care in terms of physical or emotional support, I show that building a lineage of disability poetry is also a form of care. It's self-care with poetic meaning, and it has effects not just for the individual, but also for culture more broadly. But do you remember the question my child asked when I mentioned at the beginning about when they would be able to become a parent? This is a question connected to the parenting of people with disabilities, but in an indirect, childlike way, it's also a question about the sexuality of people with disabilities. I haven't forgotten that my child is still waiting for an answer, and to explore this further, I turn to the art of Limor Ashkenazi, who deals in a complex and uncompromising way with questions of pleasure and sexuality for women with disabilities. In the slide, Limor Ashkenazi, a little woman with a bare upper body and a red cloth covering her private area, wearing underwear with her hand tied and handcuffed to her black and blue wheelchair. The actress, playwright, and photographer Limor Ashkenazi doesn't create in a vacuum. When she works on sexuality and pleasure for people with disabilities, she's pushing back against decades of negative, oppressive representations. In the book, I show how Limor Ashkenazi's work presents a unique approach to disability and creep sexuality. I analyze how, in her autobiographical photographs, in which she appears with her wheelchair in scenes drawn from BDSM practices, Ashkenazi formulates a new and radical discourse on disability female sexuality. By now, you might think that this book is about disability culture in Sweden or some other utopian place. But don't worry, it also examines accessibility in its geopolitical context, particularly in discussions around the Israeli occupation and its devastating impact on Palestinians. While Ablay's thinking framed disability as a position of political inferiority, my book shows how, at times, disability can become powerful political force. For example, drawing on insights from feminist disability studies that consider vulnerability and limitation as political tools, I invite readers to view the work of dancer and choreographer Tamar Borer as a form of political resistance. In this slide, Tamar Borer dances suspend from a rope against Tamara Erda's video, and in a different image, she's on her wheelchair with white wings. She appears multiplied with 3 heads, 4 arms, and 4 legs. I also, for some reason it doesn't work. Okay. Very Freudian that this slide was stuck. I also explore Israeli and Palestinian documentary films that follow the lives of people with disabilities in the West Bank and Gaza, including films by Israeli Jewish director Tamar Kay, the Palestinian Israeli actor and director Muhammad Bakri, and the Palestinian director Ramzi Makdassi. The slide shows the posters of 3 of their films. I examine the politics of debilitation and the ways in which the main Palestinian body becomes a visible marker for the purposeful production of impairment and injury. In this context, disability asserts a claim for justice that embodies the injustices of geopolitical power. I conclude, again, wait, I don't know why it doesn't work. Okay. I conclude my book by looking at the work of individuals with cognitive disabilities, exploring how their creative expression shape disability culture. Focusing on the poetry and art of Kfar Tikva's residents, adults with cognitive and developmental disabilities, I question who counts as part of the disability scene and how cognitive ableism shapes their scene. To sum up, the Unchosen Body explores the connection between creativity and disability, showing how disability culture can drive social change. More specifically, it examines how artists and writers with disabilities rethink, reshape, and remake public understanding of artistic, sexual, and political accessibility in Israel-Palestine. And if you're still wondering about my child's question, in the end, it really came down to two options: writing another book or just talking with them about it. I'll let you all take a guess which one I chose. Thank you very much.
So, Ilana, it's a huge pleasure to get to be in conversation with you today. Thank you so much. First, thank you so much for this powerful, important, beautiful, and really timely book. And thanks also for the invitation to talk together about it. So, one of the things I really loved when reading your book is the way that you focus on disability as a site of artistic and creative innovation. Right? I think so often, as you pointed out in your opening remarks, mainstream media, culture, medicalized assumptions about disability, they all tend to tell us a story where disability is primarily about loss and limitation. But in your work, you're really drawing attention to the way that disability can be a generative force, the way it can catalyze new insights about culture and care, and also the possibilities that come from working within constraint. So I wonder if we could talk more about that, if you could say a little bit more about how you're thinking about these questions.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Julia, first for being here, and also for the question. So I think that maybe to think about this approach to disability, again, that comes from disability studies in general, it's worthwhile to think about a term that Braun and Murray coined, that when they spoke about death gain. And the idea really was very simple at the time. The idea was that when we're thinking about deafness or deaf people, we shouldn't think about what we are losing by being deaf, but what we're basically gaining. So instead of thinking about deafness as hearing loss or any other terms that we are using, the idea was to see what do we actually gain by living with different capacities or different experiences in general. So that was like a major notion that really affected the way that I was thinking about the book in general, but it started by focusing primarily in the work of Victoria Hanna, who, as I mentioned, stuttered from childhood, and I kind of like stole, or I was inspired by the term, and I thought about her work as in terms of stutter gain, meaning how can I understand her work differently if I think about her work through her stutter. And really in the book I show how she is using her experience as a woman who stutter to reread canonical Jewish texts as Sefer Yetzirah and other texts. So that was really the way that I start thinking about the project in general. And I think Julia and I were thinking of maybe showing another example that really I think is a good example to show how we can think differently about disability in many ways. And I was hoping that we could read together in Bal Eshel Kahansky's poem, one of them. We're going to put it on the slide. I'll read it in Hebrew and Julia will read it in English. There is a limit of how much I can embarrass myself.
Me too.
Okay, so it's that one. Okay, so I'll read it in Hebrew and then we'll read the English. And again, in Bal Eshel Kahansky, this is from a book she published in 2013. The title in Hebrew is Samael Ahuvi. בראשית בראה את התקרה ואת המיטה, והמיטה הייתה תוהו ובוהו, גברים נכנסים בה ויוצאים, ורוחה מרחפת ללא טעם. ותאמר ויהי אור, ותסת את המתג ותראה אותיות ומילים ומשפטים כתובים בדבש על התקרה. ותפתח את פיה כי טובים הם, ותבדיל בין שעות המיטה לשעות התקרה. ותקרא למיטה לילה ולתקרה יום. ויהי ערב, ויהי בוקר, כל חייה עד כה.
And now in English. Is this your translation, Ilana?
Yes.
Yeah, it's beautiful.
So
In the beginning, she created the bed. I'm sorry. In the beginning, she created the ceiling and the bed. And the bed was without form and void. Men are coming in and out, and her spirit was hovering without reason. And she said, "Let there be light." And she turned on the switch. And she saw letters and words and sentences written in honey on the ceiling. And she opened her mouth because they were good. And she separated the ceiling hours from the bed hours. And she called the bed night, and the ceiling she called day. And there was evening, and there was morning, her entire being until now.
Thank you, Julia. So I think that, again, we will not get too much into this incredible poem, but just to say that I think that when I first read it, I mean, you can tell that it seems like, obviously, it's a reference to the creation story in Genesis, and instead of God creating the world, it's a woman who creates the ceiling and her own bed. And at first reading, I think that it might seem that this poem, like so many other poems in Hebrew literature, depict disability and illness as something negative, as a limitation, like you are like tied to your bed, you can't do anything, life is happening and you're not part of it, something very negative, depressing, lack of any kind of possibilities or future in general. But, and that's a big, big but, when you think about it in the larger context of disability and illness in modern Hebrew literature, I thought it actually brings to mind the poet Rachel Bluvstein, that is in modern Hebrew literature, it's like the ultimate symbol for suffering and depression and injustice and everything negative that we can think about in the juxtaposition of gender and disability. But actually, when you think about this poem in relation to Rachel Bluvstein, it actually becomes an incredible poem that addressed not just Belle Kahansky's individual experience, but located it in a much larger context of disability. And I'm referring specifically to a history of women writing from their sick beds and women creating in those physical, but also literary and cultural sick rooms. And of course, we know the sick room from Victorian literature, and we have a whole history of the sick rooms. Specifically in modern Hebrew literature, Sani Yudkov showed specifically how Rachel Bluvstein actually had, while she was sick and after she was expelled from Degania, how she created some kind of a sick room in her tiny, tiny bedroom. In which she used to write from there. She used to have guests coming to see her and discuss her literature. She had major guests in this room. Zalman Shazar, while he was still in Davar, came to be with her over there. Gnessing visited her. Bialik came to be with her and discuss literature. So it really became this unique space in which her bedroom became really literary space. And it really made me think about the question of how do a poet, disabled poet and sick poets, can create change while they are in the midst of their life and struggles at times. And also many activists in disability studies think about this relationship between being in your bed and wanting to change the world. And one of the quotes that I really love is by Joanna Chedva, who wrote a beautiful piece called Sick Women Theory. And in this piece, they ask, how do you throw a brick through the window of a bank if you can't get out of bed? Right? It's a half funny question, but it's an extremely serious question. And I think that it's a relevant question for us today. How do you create change when you cannot leave your room, you cannot sometimes leave your bed even, etc. And many activists has answered these questions at the very act of writing and protesting that can happen in those cultural spaces is actually the thing that create change. Different kind of changes. Some people talk about changes in terms of approach to body minds, political changes, etc. And in a way, I think that, Julia, for your questions before, this is what really interests me in this book, like this moment in which supposedly from the outside, it seems that you have no agency, that you cannot do anything. Those artists and writers actually create those spaces of alternative ways of thinking about our society, thinking about ourselves, and this is what I basically show. So by the very fact that someone in 2000 and something in Belle Kahansky has a reference to Rachel and have other references to Yona Volach and to other poets that were either disabled or sick, they create some kind of genealogy that creates this space, this literary space for themselves. They basically create what we call in disability studies a care web, a space in which they take care of each other, either physically sometimes, but also poetically in this case. And the moment that those women start thinking about themselves as a community that support each other, this becomes a political act, and a very significant political act in the context of Israeli society. Long answer to this question, but yeah.
No, Ilana, it's making me think though about the way the way that you're talking about the significance of the bed and the bed as a site of creativity feels to me so potent politically, because it really counters the way I think that non-disabled people often treat the sick bed as an aberration. Right? A thing that you have to get out of before you can do anything, before you can create, before you can write, before you make culture. And both Chedva and who you quoted and Inbal Eshel Kahansky are really saying no to that. Right? I think one of the things that I find so moving about this poem is the way that Kahansky claims the bed as a site of revelation. I mean, this illusion, this gorgeous illusion that she offers to Genesis 1, these images of primordial creation, the bed without form and void, the making of light when she flicks the light switch. I mean, it's a very chutzpahdik moment here, actually, right? She's the one who turns on the light. And then this image of seeing the letters and words and sentences written in honey on the ceiling. I love this image so much. You know, it really, it's so evocative of revelation, but it's a really specific revelation. It's a kind of revelation that is steeped in the lived experience of disability. It can't happen without the bed. And I think it's worth also saying it can't happen without the hours spent staring at the ceiling. Right? It can't happen without the frustration and the boredom and the irritation and the pain. So I wonder if we could talk a little bit about this, right? I think it feels really important to acknowledge this element, because there has sometimes been a tendency within disability culture to really focus on celebrating disability in a way that can gloss over pain. I mean, and of course, from a disability perspective, that move is often a kind of cultural resistance, right? It's a way of resisting and rejecting mainstream society's tendency to just see disability as a kind of loss. But I think there's something about this poem and about your work, your writing about disability, and the work of many of the artists that you're examining here that really centers this question of how do you make room for anger, for pain, for exhaustion, for fragility, for loss, alongside creativity and pleasure. So I'd be, yeah, really curious to hear more about that.
Yeah, thank you for this question and for the reading of the poem. And I think that really you raise a point that at the beginning I really struggled with when I started writing the book, and I really started to struggle when I encounter the poetry of a beautiful writer, Orit Marton, that her first poetry book was published in 2010, and the title of the book was To Be Trapped in My Body, להיות כלואה בגופי. And the entire book really describes her experience as a woman with severe physical disability, and all of the descriptions are really referring to disability as a prison. And she talks about the pain, and she constantly talks about the enormous gap that she experienced between her intellectual capacities and her physical, what she calls her physical limitations. And that's really the core of the book. And I didn't know how to work really with her book, because as you said, like in disability studies, we have this tendency to celebrate disability, and we kind of like feel that the innovation that we have to bring to society is to work against this stereotype as disability is something only negative and that limits you, et cetera, et cetera. So I think that at the beginning I was like, okay, I'm just gonna talk about internalized ableism. That was like the easy way, but it felt really like cheating. And it was, I think, not an honest way to address it. So I didn't continue with this path because it's not my experience. And if Orit Marton write this way, I'm not the one to say that she's just internalizing something. But then I, of course, look at writings of other women with different kinds of disabilities, and I encounter the work of Liz Crow, who is a beautiful writer, and she really talks about. She takes this model of social of disability as something that the limitations mainly come from society's lack of accommodation. One step farther, and she said, you know what? Yes, many of our barriers or many of our challenges are related to the fact that we live in a society that doesn't accommodate our physical, mental, emotional needs. Yes, for sure, some of our pain is related to that, but she's saying we can't ignore also the fact that if you live with chronic pain, it hurts. If you live with chronic episodes of depression, it's hard and it doesn't feel good. And she said, like, we cannot ignore our bodies and mind just for the sake of this celebration. And I think that it's of course not something unique to people with disabilities, right? We're familiar with Heather Lav, who wrote about a similar tension in queer experiences, right? How do we create this progress or celebratory future for queer people without acknowledging the suffering and pain that comes sometimes with this lived experience. So those tensions are there with in other contexts. But I think that I really work with Heather Lav a lot in the sense that her writing enabled me to be able to hold both aspects without needing to really choose. It's not my role to choose. And with creating this space of I can talk about pain and suffering without it really harming any kind of celebration of disability. And that I think enabled me to really include Orit Marton with this very negative experience of disability in the book. But in a way, that was an easy way to solve this tension in a way. But I think what's maybe a less obvious example would be to go back for a second to Limor Ashkenazi that I mentioned before, who is a wheelchair user, a small woman who photographed herself in different kinds of BDSM position. She's also a playwright and a writer, and she's a very interesting artist. She does many things. And after I finished the book, I did an interview with her for Lilith magazine. And in the interview, I asked her about her choice to practice BDSM and to have it in her art. And in the photograph that you see here that I showed before, you see Limor Ashkenazi, a little woman, lying on what seems like a mattress tied to her blue and black wheelchair. So, and her work really, like, even just if we would focus on sexuality and pleasure, her work is incredible because she's working in a cultural space in which the only cultural possibilities for women with disabilities in Israel in terms of sexuality and pleasure is either to deny their sexuality, like to think about themselves as asexual, or as constantly being on risk, as always being on the edge of being raped, basically. These are the two cultural options, right? You saw, for those of you who saw Shchur, the movie, this is like the urtext of women with disabilities. So Limor Ashkenazi works within this context. So first and foremost, presenting her body, talking about her sexuality, about pleasure is already something radical. But more specifically, I want us to read a very short quote that something that she said when I asked her specifically about pain, because I think, Julia, that is related to not just to how do I in the book refer to pain or negative aspects of disability, but how do the artists themselves think about it. So here is the quote. So she says, I, meaning Limor Ashkenazi, I want to talk about the matter of pain, okay? I live with pain every day, and its ever-changing nature brings physical challenges. As I contemplated my attraction to BDSM, I began to relate it to pain. While BDSM involves pain, I distinguish between different types of pain. I learned that there is pain that can be pleasurable to me. There is a pain that can be good and pleasant, one that I choose when and how I want to feel it. In this context, I have control and freedom. Through BDSM, I leave my disability for a moment, as it were, and my body actually receives a different kind of care, not medical or typical care, but care born from pleasure, giving, and enjoyment. So this is, I think, a very interesting way of thinking about not just kink sexuality and BDSM, but also about pain itself and different ways to communicate or with your own pain or address your own pain as something that can also be pleasurable, something that I can work with and locate in different spaces in my life. So I think that Limor Ashkenazi is a fascinating example because she both addresses the ableist aspect of the society that she's living in, but she's also addressing her own physical chronic pain and doesn't shy away from any of those discussions.
So Julia and Ilana, I know that you have a lot more productive discussion that would be very helpful for us, but I also want to make sure that there's room for questions, if that's okay. So we have about 10 minutes more before we will continue the discussion over lunch, to which everybody is invited. People online, please feel free to continue contributing questions, although I have to say I'm going to give priority to people who are present in the room for now. Can I just see by a show of hands like who we have who's interested in asking a question? Otherwise, I'm going to jump right in. So yes, can we take a couple at once? Is that okay with you? So let's hear from Inbar and Ziva, please. Thank you.
Maybe a very specific question about what you mentioned regarding the case from Rachel, the poet, that people came to her bedroom, and I was sure that you're going to say that she created a sort of, and I was sure that you're going to say salon. And I wondered if there is some alternative spaces where those people can meet, maybe due to new technologies, or do they have an alternative space, some alternative spaces for those creations and those and their activities, either political, either just right.
If you could repeat the question briefly, because it's not possible to hear.
Of course, after the question is finished, I'll repeat it for the microphone. But no, that was the plan. Yeah.
Thank you, Ilana, so much. This is almost too simple of a question. Louder, even louder. Okay. But if on one foot, if thinking about all of the artists that you examine, how sort of does their work offer liberation or freedom to the larger society? What is sort of, if you had to boil it down to a few things, what are they offering?
Let me repeat that just for the microphone and for our interpreters. So firstly, we have a question regarding Rachel's sickbed kind of salon. And the question was, are there spaces where people with disabilities, perhaps using new technologies, can come together to engage in art or activism? And secondly, what is offered to society as a whole by this kind of art?
Small question. Thank you, Ziva. So I'll start with maybe the easiest maybe question, and I think Julia, maybe if you feel free also to say something, because I feel that you're right. Like, and when Sunny writes about Rachel Blufstein, she talks about it in terms of sickbed salon, and in the book I connected to this tradition of women creating different kinds of salon. But if I understood your question, you're asking about today, and today really we have a lot of groups that function in a way, in a similar way, through social media, of course. And social media, we can say a lot about it, but in terms of disability and different community, it actually enables many people to find communities and create new communities. I think that one of the biggest maybe example is adults on the spectrum that have different creative communities online, and that they really they don't show their works in like museums or anything like that anymore, but it's all like on their social media, and they react to each other, and they have their whole social life through those aspects. So in this sense, social media is really an amazing resource to create those clusters, if you wish, of communities. In terms of the question, what do artists with disability contribute to society? Alex mentioned the 20% off of the book, so that's probably the easiest answer. But no, but it's hard for me to answer quickly. But I think that maybe one aspect that we didn't have a chance to talk about, but is related to the question, is actually the geopolitical aspects of the book and the focus of the book on disability justice. Because I spoke a little bit about accessibility, and accessibility, not just physical accessibility, but accessibility to the art world. And of course, we know that when we have different voices in the art world, it changes the dynamics and it changes everything. But more specifically, the book focuses on disability justice, meaning in the intersections of disability with other aspects of identity, specifically in this book in relation to settler colonialism, state violence, etc. So I'm looking, for example, on Palestinians film, and I show how they're basically uncover or expose kind of some of the techniques that Israel is using in Gaza and in the West Bank and in other areas in order to, in relation to disability specifically. So in a way, I show how, like, in the global north, we think about disability as something that is part of life. You might be born with a disability, you might become disabled at certain stage of your life, but it's something inherent to just being a human being, right? And therefore we have to learn how to live with it. We can celebrate it. We can do many, many things with it. But this is a very like global north kind of approach. When we look at disability in a geopolitical context, specifically in my book on Israel-Palestine, we see a very different approach to disability. Disability becomes something that one group of people with power is doing to another group of people on purpose. And this is a totally different discourse. And this discourse is, if you're willing to listen to this discourse, that is a major discourse in Palestinian cinema, as an Israeli, your approach to what people sometimes call the conflict might change. So that's just a small example of what thinking differently through bodies and minds that are different might change, maybe.
I think we have time for one, maybe two more brief questions from Yael and Anastasia.
I was going to follow up on what you were just saying, the geopolitical context, and connected to what you were saying earlier about disability being generative and celebrated, and ask how we can think about those questions in the context of not only being disabled, but specifically use the term being maimed. And that struck me as a really important way to think about it, right? Is that thinking about being maimed as generative is obviously very different than thinking about a disability that someone is born with, or even that someone has an illness as a result of an illness, and especially in the context of an ongoing occupation and worse. So I was wondering if you had anything to add to that.
Thanks, yeah, and I'll repeat that in just a second. But Anastasia, you want to?
Salons, female salons, I assume French salons that it all originated. So I get curious what larger European or not just European intellectual traditions your author engaged with and why they are important.
Thanks. So the two questions were, firstly, just to hear some more about the consequences of this distinction between disability and what Yael is, the word you used was maiming, and what that says for art and how to think about disability culture in that respect. And secondly, the question was, Anastasia wanted to know more about how the intellectual traditions of Victorian and pre-Victorian sick rooms have influenced the poets and artists that you're looking at.
Thank you for these two questions. So for the question about the geopolitics, I refer mainly to the work of Puar in the book and the notion of the right to maim, which basically means that she's talking specifically about the US in Afghanistan and about Israel in occupied Palestine, about a situation in which soldiers shoot in order to harm but not to kill. And according to this theory, there is a purpose and benefit in maiming people instead of killing them. And maybe the Palestinian body becomes a symbol, a walking or a moving testimony to the potential power of, in this example, Israel. So definitely this is a huge discourse among disability scholars when it comes to the geopolitical aspects of disability, and this is really what I address in the book. And again, it has major implications of our life today. We're in the midst of war. We're talking about Iran, about Lebanon. We're in the midst of an ongoing genocide in Gaza, ethnic cleansing in the West Bank. It's this maiming and disability is something that happens not just on a daily basis, but on every second and different aspects of disability. I just want to say that in the book, I'm not coming from political science. I'm not a historian. I'm looking at the art and literature of artists with disabilities and what do they do. But again, when we're looking at Palestinian cinema specifically, it's a very, I mean, at least what I'm looking at is a very political cinema. Obviously, and their approach to disability is very different than what we see even among, and that's what I want to say, that it's not that I'm comparing a very conservative Israeli film to Palestinian film, but I'm looking at films, or at Israeli films that are addressing the occupation, supposedly from a very leftist approach, and I show how they address disability in a way that basically serves Israeli narratives of the occupation, comparing to Palestinian film cinema that address the geopolitical aspects of disability. So there, it's a very different narrative. As for the question of influences, so I would just say that it's actually a very interesting question for me. Not just because of the specific European influences on Rachel, of course, that immigrated from Russia, etc., but it's a larger question of that in the opening of the book I refer to as a translation issue in regards to disability, because the book really contains some enormous gaps that I didn't know how to address that are related to the questions of influence. And I'm just going to share a very short anecdote that when I went to Israel to meet with one of the artists, I went to her house and we had a beautiful meeting, and she showed me work in progress, and I was so excited. And immediately at some point, of course, I couldn't help it, and I start to analyze with her own work, and I was like, this really reminds me the work of that, and this reminds me this and this, and this is so much like Care Web, and this is this. And at some point she looked at me and was like, I have to write down the references because I don't know any of them. And it was a beautiful moment for me, because it really showed the gap between her world and my world. And really, I mean, I'm in the book, the book is written in English about Israeli society, mainly Israel-Palestine, but all the theories are from here, and I'm kind of like using them to read a different culture that doesn't necessarily share those influences or ideas. So it really created this beautiful gap for me that I wanted to maintain throughout the book. I didn't just want to solve it. It was very easy for me to say these are the influences and that's what's happening and this is what they're doing. But I really wanted to keep this open, because the major gap was, of course, that I myself am not a woman with a disability, and I'm writing about disabled authors, right? So this is already a translation issue and an ethical issue, of course. So that's my, like, on the side answer to you, and we can talk later about specific examples.
So with apologies for putting you on the spot, Julia, in our last 60 seconds, which you're splitting with Ilana, Do you have any closing remarks you'd like to share for a few 30 seconds?
Well, I'll just say again, thank you, Ilana, so much, both for this really beautiful event, but also for this book, which does such important work, documenting, lifting up, illuminating, and really opening these webs of care that have, that exist within Israeli society among Israelis with disabilities and the kind of disabled artist communities, these overlapping spaces. I just think it's very, very important to think about the way in which this work and all of the complexities that are unfolding right now in the world with amidst the geopolitical context, which you named so powerfully. Thank you so much for the powerful work that you're doing.
Ilana, would you like to make any? Well,
Very
I want to thank very much Professor Julia Watts Belser for joining us, and I want to thank once again and congratulate Professor Ilana Szobel on the publication of this marvelous book. Thank you.
Thank you, Julia.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining us online and in the room. Have a lovely afternoon. And everybody is very warmly welcomed to lunch, which will be in the reading room just down the corridor, just outside the glass doors at the end.